I entered the hotel carrying an envelope that weighed more than it looked. Every step through the bright, cold lobby felt like martyrdom, but my focus was relentless. I knew what I was about to do. I knew that letter would change everything. It was an ultimatum, a confession that I knew, that I had discovered the truth that my mind insisted on denying. The world around me seemed so out of place, people talking, laughing, oblivious to the imminent destruction that was happening silently inside me. I climbed into the elevator, each floor being announced with a ding that echoed like a warning. The room number was engraved in my mind. When the door opened, there I was, standing in front of a silent, brightly lit corridor, like a stage set for the climax of a tragic play. With every step, the weight of the envelope seemed to pull my hand to the floor, but I carried on. There was no turning back. I reached the door and, without hesitation, slid the letter underneath. I knew they were there. Clothes scattered on the floor, the muffled murmur of complicit laughter that made my stomach turn. I went back to the car and waited. It wasn't long before the bedroom lights were turned on. I imagined the scene. They, still drunk from their transgression, opening the envelope together, perhaps laughing at a possible misunderstanding, until the weight of the words hit them like a punch. Then my phone rang. It was her. I knew what was coming, but even so, the sound of her voice feigning concern and innocence was like a knife going in slowly. "Love, what does that mean? Where are you? We need to talk." I smiled a sad, tired smile. "We have nothing more to talk about. You made your choice, now I'm making mine." She tried. She pleaded. The lies poured out like sweet poison, each word reminding me of the days, months, maybe years, that I lived like an idiot. I pretended not to see the signs, the deleted messages, the lame excuses, the perfume that wasn't mine. But there, that night, as I listened to his desperate voice on the phone, I was no longer blind. "You knew I was here, didn't you? How did you find out? Please, we need to talk in person. This is a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding. I just wanted you to read it with him by your side. Because now, you can both face what you've done together." The line went silent. I could imagine his expression, his mind working desperately to find a way out, an excuse. But there wasn't one. She knew that I knew. And I knew that that silence was the confession I had never received directly. I hung up the phone before she could continue, before I could waver. The silence in the car was deafening, but for the first time in a long time, I felt in control. Memories began to flood my mind. The moments when I had trusted blindly, loved unreservedly, built a future alongside her. And all of that being torn apart, piece by piece, as she betrayed me with that man. He, of course, was a symbol of everything I couldn't be. That charismatic, confident boss she mentioned casually in conversation. "He's so smart, so funny." I thought they were just harmless comments. How foolish I was. And now, there they were, facing the consequences together. I didn't know what would happen next, but there was something I couldn't ignore. Deep down, it wasn't just the fact that she had betrayed me. It was her choice, the moment she decided that everything we had built wasn't enough. What was left now? What would come after that letter? There was no turning back, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face whatever came. But the question that kept echoing in my mind was, were they ready? Welcome to the channel where we explore life's deepest and most exciting dramas. Here, we don't support betrayal in any way, as we believe it can devastate lives, families, and trust. Our stories are fictional, but they reflect the harsh consequences that betrayal can bring. Get ready now for a shocking narrative, full of twists and turns and intense emotions. Fasten your seatbelts, because this story is going to move you. Have a good listen. Ethan had always believed that love was built on solid foundations, a mixture of trust, admiration and, above all, respect. He had met Mia when they were both young, still full of dreams and ready to conquer the world together. At the time, their connection was instantaneous, as if fate had conspired to bring them together. Ethan was a determined, methodical and practical man. He had an almost predictable routine, which gave him a sense of control over his life. He worked for a logistics company, where he spent hours planning routes and strategies, his mind always organized like a chessboard. Mia, on the other hand, was pure spontaneity. An artist with a passion for colors and shapes, she transformed canvases into universes and lived as if every day were a new blank canvas. She was the perfect balance for Ethan. When he got lost in excessive planning, Mia reminded him to breathe, to live in the present. It was as if she brought light to the shadows of his logic, and he offered her a firm foundation in the midst of creative chaos. Their first years together were full of discoveries and adventures. Marriage came early, but for both of them it seemed natural. The house they bought symbolized the life they were building side by side. Mia transformed the place into a haven of creativity, with paintings scattered all over the walls, brushes forgotten in unexpected corners and an energy that made every room vibrate with her personality. Ethan, meticulous as he was sometimes annoyed by the creative mess, but always gave in when he saw the joy on Mia's face as she finished yet another masterpiece. The years passed, and with them came responsibilities. Ethan was promoted several times, which brought greater financial stability, but also long working hours and frequent travel. Mia, although proud of her husband's successes, sometimes felt the weight of loneliness. It wasn't something she admitted easily, but the silent nights at home began to create cracks in her vivacity. Ethan noticed these changes. He tried to compensate for her absence with grand gestures, surprise trips, expensive gifts and dinners in fancy restaurants. For Mia, however, something simpler was missing, his presence, the time that couldn't be bought or replaced. She knew that Ethan did it all for love, but somewhere along the way, they both began to lose their way. Close friends noticed the changes. Emily, a longtime friend of Mia's, often encouraged her to talk about her feelings. "You need to open up to Ethan," Emily would say, "he's not a mind reader, Mia. And you know he'd do anything for you." Mia agreed with a wistful smile, but avoided these conversations. For her, admitting that something was wrong was like recognizing that the fairy tale they had built together was cracking. On Ethan's side, work had become a refuge. Although he loved Mia deeply, he felt that something invisible was seeping between them. Conversations became shorter, silences longer. He believed that stress at work and the pressures of everyday life were to blame. "Things will get better," he thought, almost like a mantra. The house, which had once been a home full of laughter and complicity, now seemed to carry a tension that neither of them knew how to dispel. Still, they clung to the memories of happy days. The evenings of wine and music, the impromptu walks on the beach, the dancing in the living room for no reason. Ethan often found himself looking at Mia as she painted, admiring the concentration in her eyes and the way the colors came to life under her brushes. He still loved her, of that he had no doubt. Mia also looked at Ethan, often without him realizing it. She saw the hard-working, dedicated man he was, but she missed the man who made her laugh to tears, who improvised picnics in the backyard and who seemed to see her soul. It was as if they were both trapped in parallel bubbles, unable to cross the barrier that separated them. Even with these cracks, the routine went on like clockwork. The two of them still shared tender moments, small gestures that showed that love still existed, even if it was suffocated by layers of emotional distance. Ethan still brought Mia flowers on their wedding anniversaries, and she still left sweet notes in his bag before trips. These acts, although simple, were an attempt by both of them to rescue what seemed to be slipping through their fingers. One day, as Ethan prepared for another of his work trips, Mia watched him from across the room. "You're always coming and going," she commented, trying to sound casual. "That's what work is for," he replied with a smile. "But you know that everything I do is for us, right?" Mia nodded, but didn't answer. In her heart, she wanted him to understand what words couldn't express. The couple's friends, although they didn't say it directly, noticed the growing distance between them. Emily, always perceptive, even commented to Ethan on one of the rare occasions he showed up at a social gathering. "Mia misses you," she said bluntly. Ethan was surprised. "She knows I do everything for us," he replied, almost defensively. "Maybe it's time to show that in other ways," Emily suggested. Back at work, Ethan started planning a surprise for Mia. He wanted to rekindle the flame that seemed to have gone out. He researched romantic destinations, bought tickets to a music concert she loved and began to draft a perfect weekend for the two of them. Mia, on the other hand, tried to find ways to deal with the feelings of emptiness that consumed her. She immersed herself in work, accepting invitations to exhibitions and art events in the hope of filling the space Ethan left. That evening, while Mia was finishing a painting in vibrant shades of red and gold, Ethan came home early. He watched her for a few minutes before announcing his presence. "This is new," he said, indicating the canvas. Mia smiled shyly. "It's something I'm trying," she replied. There was tension in the air, but also a glimpse of something they both couldn't define. "I was thinking," Ethan began, hesitantly. "We should take a few days for ourselves. Maybe travel, do something different." Mia looked at him, surprised. "You think you can disconnect from work for that long?" Ethan laughed, but there was something serious in his answer. "I think I need to." The introduction of the idea brought a moment of hope. They both felt, if only briefly, that perhaps there was a way to recover what they had lost. But what Ethan didn't know, and what Mia wasn't ready to admit, was that the cracks in their marriage went deeper than they realized. Ethan's planned trip could be the turning point they so desperately needed. Or perhaps it was the catalyst for a truth that neither of them was prepared to face. Ethan's planned trip was a rare moment of positive expectation. He threw himself into the preparations with dedication, believing that this time together would be a way of rediscovering his connection with Mia. For her, the invitation came with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Although she wanted to be excited, she felt that there was something different about Ethan's gestures, as if there was an emotional distance masked by his attempt to reconnect. Even so, Mia accepted the proposal, convinced that perhaps this was the beginning of a reconnection. The days leading up to the trip were filled with small moments of hope. Ethan made sure everything was perfect, and Mia, though torn, tried hard to live up to his expectations. The night before departure, he came into the living room holding 2 glasses of wine and sat down next to her on the sofa. "Tomorrow will be the start of something new," he said, smiling. Mia smiled back, but something in her gaze seemed distant, as if she was weighing up every word. The trip itself got off to a promising start. The chosen destination, a seaside resort, provided the perfect setting for what Ethan hoped would be a new stage. They spent the first few days in relative harmony, between walks on the beach and candlelit dinners. For a few moments, it felt as if they were recovering something they had lost, as if the weight of their responsibilities had finally lifted. But for Mia, these moments of relief were interspersed with conflicting thoughts. She tried hard to enjoy Ethan's company, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something inside her was different, as if a shadow hung over every gesture of affection. While Ethan made plans for the next few days, Mia was often lost in thought, watching the horizon with a restless gaze. On the 4th night of the trip, Ethan noticed a change in Mia's behavior. During dinner, she was quieter than usual, fiddling with her plate without really eating. He tried to strike up a conversation, but her answers were short, almost monosyllabic. Finally, he decided to address what seemed to be in the air. "Mia, what's going on? You seem so distant." She raised her eyes, visibly uncomfortable. "It's nothing, Ethan. I'm just tired." But he knew that tone. It wasn't tiredness, it was something deeper, something she was hiding. He decided not to push her that night, but worry began to grow inside him. The next day, while Ethan left early for a planned activity, Mia stayed at the resort. She claimed to be unwell, but in reality she needed a moment alone to organize her thoughts. Sitting on the balcony, she gazed at the sea while trying to deal with the whirlwind of emotions that seemed to be on the verge of exploding. It was as if the weight of everything she had been feeling was about to overflow, and she didn't know how to deal with it. Later, when Ethan returned, he found Mia different. She seemed calmer, but also more distant. He noticed that she had her cell phone in her hands more than usual, typing messages and smiling discreetly at the screen. "Anything interesting?" he asked casually. Mia quickly put the phone away. "Nothing much. Just Emily. She asked me how we're doing." Ethan tried to ignore the unease that this scene provoked in him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. Over the next few days, he began to notice small details that, on their own, might have meant nothing, but together began to form a pattern. Mia was more reserved, more evasive. There were times when she seemed lost in thought, disconnected from the reality around her. Back to his routine after the trip, Ethan decided to focus on work, hoping that things would return to normal over time. But Mia continued to exhibit behaviors that he couldn't ignore. She went out more often, made excuses for long absences and, most worryingly, always seemed to have her phone to hand, protecting it as if it were a secret to be kept. Ethan wasn't a paranoid man, but he couldn't ignore the signs. He began to watch Mia more closely, looking for answers to what was going on. One day, while she was in the shower, he saw her phone forgotten on the table. The temptation to pick it up and find out the truth was almost irresistible, but he hesitated. He knew that once he crossed that line, there would be no turning back. Still, the weight of doubt was unbearable. Finally, he gave in. When he unlocked his phone, he found messages that confirmed his worst suspicions. There was a constant exchange of messages between Mia and an unknown number, full of words he never imagined she would use with someone else. The tone of the messages was intimate, filled with a tenderness that should have been reserved only for him. Ethan felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. When Mia came out of the shower, she found Ethan sitting in the living room, her phone in hand. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her with a mixture of pain and disappointment. "Who is he?" was all she managed to ask. Mia froze, the color draining from her face. She knew there was no denying it. "Ethan, please listen to me," she began, but he interrupted her. "I just want to know the truth, Mia. Nothing more." The tension in the room was almost palpable, and the silence that followed was even more deafening than any scream could have been. Mia finally admitted it. It was someone from work, someone with whom she had crossed boundaries she should never have crossed. Ethan listened in silence, her every word piercing like a blade. It wasn't just the act itself that destroyed him, but the fact that she had chosen to hide it, even as he tried to salvage what they had. "For how long?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Mia hesitated before answering, but she knew she couldn't lie. "A few months." Ethan closed his eyes, trying to process what he had just heard. Every memory, every moment of doubt now seemed to fit into a cruel puzzle. He got up without saying another word and left the house, leaving Mia alone with her thoughts and regrets. As he drove aimlessly through the city, Ethan knew that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Something told him that there was more behind Mia's betrayal, something he couldn't yet see, but which was about to be revealed. Ethan stayed up all night, Mia's words echoing like a disjointed symphony in his mind. "A few months." That seemed to resonate louder than any other confession. He tried to find answers in the silence, but the emptiness around him was as oppressive as the pain he felt. Every detail of the messages he had read, every gesture that had once seemed trivial, now became glaring evidence of the distance that had come between them. However, there was something else, something he couldn't name, but which he knew was there, hidden. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He needed complete answers, not just fragments. He called Mia, asking her to find a moment to talk at home. His tone was controlled, but there was a firmness that she couldn't ignore. "I'll be there at 8, she replied, knowing she had no choice. When Mia arrived, she found Ethan sitting in the living room, envelope in hand. She felt a knot forming in her stomach, the tension almost unbearable. He looked up at her, his eyes cold and focused. "Before we start, I want you to know that I'm willing to listen, but only if it's the truth. Anything other than that will be the end." Mia nodded nervously. She sat down in a chair opposite him and began to speak, the words coming out hesitantly. She explained how her involvement with her boss had started innocently enough, an after-work dinner that had evolved into something more. She cried, trying to justify her choices, but Ethan remained motionless, as if expecting something more. "That's not all, is it?" he interrupted, his voice firm. Mia looked up, confused and frightened. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to buy time. "I feel like there's something you haven't told me yet. Something bigger than just, you two." He leaned forward, holding out the envelope. "And you'd better be honest, because I have information too." Mia froze. She knew she couldn't hide it any longer. Every fiber of her being begged to escape, but Ethan wouldn't give her the chance. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice shaking. Getting involved with him wasn't just a momentary choice. There was something at stake. She paused, as if mustering the courage to continue was an internal struggle. "He threatened me, Ethan. He used information about your company, about the contracts you managed. He said he could harm you and I gave in." Ethan blinked, confused. "Are you saying that he manipulated you into it? That it was blackmail?" "I didn't know how to handle it," she admitted, tears welling up. "At first, I thought I could control the situation, but he kept pushing. And the more I tried to resist, the more he found ways to keep me involved. He used our lives, our vulnerabilities, as leverage." Ethan's anger was palpable, but there was something deeper, a sense of betrayal that went beyond Mia. Her boss had not only crossed professional boundaries, but also used private information in a way that put Ethan's entire life at risk. He took a deep breath, trying to process the implications. "You should have told me," he finally said, his voice laden with hurt. "You chose to deal with it alone and left me in the dark, even though you knew what was at stake." "I was afraid," she replied. "Afraid of letting you down, of losing you. I thought that if I kept everything under control, you'd never have to know." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "And by doing that, you not only let me down, you destroyed everything we had. Do you understand that, Mia? Everything." She lowered her head, unable to answer. The weight of what she had confessed was overwhelming, but what terrified her most was the possibility of never recovering what they had lost. Ethan stood up, starting to pace back and forth. "He threatened my company, my career. But why? What would he get out of it?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Mia hesitated, but knew she had to answer. "He wanted to control me. He thought that by having power over me, he could get information about you and the contracts you managed. It was all a way of leveraging his position in the company, Ethan. It wasn't just about me. It was about you." Ethan felt as if the floor was caving in again. It wasn't just an emotional betrayal, it was a direct attack on his integrity, on his professional life. He looked at Mia, the mixture of pain and anger in his eyes almost unbearable. "I'll deal with it," he finally said, his voice low but determined. "But not for you. I'll deal with it because I won't let him destroy what I've built. And after that, we'll see what's left." Mia tried to move closer, but he held up his hand, stopping her. "Not now, Mia. I need time. And you need to think about what honesty really means. Because this has gone too far." She watched him leave, the sound of the door closing echoing through the house. She sat alone in the living room, the tears finally spilling freely. She knew that the worst was yet to come, but at that moment, she could only hope that there was still something to save. Meanwhile, Ethan was already on the move, determined to confront the man who had manipulated his wife and threatened her life. Ethan parked the car in front of the imposing building where Mia's boss worked. The glass facade reflected the cloudy sky, a harbinger of the imminent confrontation. He took a deep breath, trying to contain the anger boiling up inside him. The man he was about to face was not only his wife's lover, but also someone who had threatened to destroy his life in a calculated way. Ethan knew he needed to keep his cool, but the weight of betrayal and manipulation made his resolve waver. Inside the building, the atmosphere was quiet and professional. Ethan walked towards the reception desk and asked for the man. The receptionist, a young, well-dressed woman, looked at him curiously before pointing the way. "He's in the conference room, but you'll need to wait a moment. He's in a meeting." Ethan didn't reply. He just nodded and followed the corridor, his footsteps echoing. He stopped in front of the glass door of the conference room, from where he could see the man sitting at the head of the table, gesturing as he spoke. The contrast between the serenity of the environment and the turmoil inside Ethan was almost unbearable. He waited only as long as it took for the meeting to end before abruptly opening the door. The man looked up, surprised by the interruption. "Mr. Carter, can I help you?" he asked, a polite smile appearing on his lips, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected presence. "Yes, you can," replied Ethan, his voice controlled but fraught with tension. "Can we talk in private?" The man hesitated for a moment before beckoning Ethan to follow him into the next office. As soon as the door closed, Ethan crossed his arms and faced him. "I know everything." The man's expression changed, the smile disappearing instantly. He leaned back in his chair, but said nothing, as if trying to assess the situation. Finally, he leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. "And what exactly do you think you know, Ethan? I know that you used my wife to try to manipulate me. I know you used her information to get close to my company's contracts. You think you're clever, but now everything is exposed." The man smiled in a corner, a gesture that made Ethan's anger grow even more. Mia is a grown woman. The choices she made were hers. And as for the rest, that sounds more like paranoia on your part. Ethan took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You can try to twist the facts all you like, but I have proof. Messages, phone calls. Even your pathetic attempt to intimidate her is on record. So don't give me any excuses." The man stared at him for a moment, assessing Ethan's intensity. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice now less confident. "I want you to resign. I want you to leave the company and disappear from Mia's life and mine. And if you ever think of touching anything that involves my career or my family again, I guarantee the consequences will be far worse." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. The man seemed to consider his options before leaning back in his chair again, now with a more resigned expression. "All right," he said at last. "I was tired of this farce anyway." "Good," replied Ethan, his voice cold. "You have until the end of the day to do it." When Ethan left the building, his relief was short-lived. He knew that this was only part of the battle. The pain of Mia's betrayal was still there, an open wound that wouldn't heal so easily. He drove aimlessly for a while, lost in thought, until he realized that he couldn't go home right away. Not while he was still carrying so much anger and confusion. He parked in a quiet park and sat on a bench, watching the trees swaying in the wind. The emptiness around him seemed to reflect his internal state. As he stared at the horizon, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Mia. "We need to talk. Please meet me at home." Ethan hesitated, but knew that this conversation was inevitable. He couldn't put it off forever. He got back in the car and drove home, his heart heavy with anticipation of what was to come. When he entered, he found Mia sitting in the living room, her eyes red from crying. She stood up when she saw him, but didn't approach him. I don't even know where to start," she said, her voice fragile. Then be direct, replied Ethan, bluntly. Why did you let this happen? Why did you exclude me from the decision to deal with something so serious? I didn't want you to see how lost I was, Mia replied, her voice breaking. I was afraid that if you knew, it would break us up. Don't you realize that hiding only made things worse? Ethan shook his head in disbelief. You think you were protecting me, but you were actually destroying everything. Mia started crying again, but this time she didn't try to justify herself. She knew there were no words that could repair the damage. I don't expect you to forgive me, she finally said. But I needed you to know that I never meant to hurt you. Ethan sighed, exhausted. I need time, Mia. I need to understand how to move on after all this. She nodded, knowing that she couldn't demand anything from him right now. The house fell silent, everyone lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of the chaos their lives had become. Ethan knew that the future was uncertain, but one thing was clear, the decisions they made from then on would shape everything that followed. Ethan spent the next few days in a state of confusion. The confrontation with Mia's boss had brought an initial sense of control, but it had also left an emptiness that he couldn't ignore. Mia's betrayal, while painful, now seemed intertwined with something even more complex, the way their lives had been manipulated by someone else. Every thought about it made him question his decisions, his marriage and even his own ability to trust. Mia, for her part, tried to keep her distance, but she didn't want to appear indifferent either. She spent hours in the room she used to use as a studio, but now the creative mess that used to be so characteristic of her seemed absent. The canvases remained empty, the brushes untouched. She felt paralyzed, torn between guilt and the fear of losing Ethan forever. Still, she knew that pushing him would be useless. Ethan needed space, and she somehow had to accept that. A week later, Ethan made a decision. He needed clarity, and that meant putting everything into perspective. He booked a session with a therapist, someone impartial who could help him organize his thoughts. During the first appointment, he said little about the details, but the therapist asked a question that kept echoing in his mind: are you seeking revenge or resolution? Ethan couldn't answer immediately. He thought that confronting Mia's boss would be enough, but the emotional weight was still there. He still didn't know if he could forgive Mia or even move on without her. Meanwhile, Mia, on an impulse, decided to visit Emily, the longtime friend who had always been her confidant. Emily knew what had happened, although Mia avoided going into too much detail. When she arrived at her friend's house, she was greeted with a warm hug, but also a serious look. You know I'm not going to put my hand on your head, right? Said Emily, bluntly. I know, Mia replied, sighing. But I needed to talk to someone. Emily listened attentively as Mia told her everything. For the first time, Mia put into words not only the events, but also her feelings, her confusion, her bad choices. Emily remained silent until the end, then asked, do you think Ethan still loves you? Mia hesitated. I don't know. He's so distant. But I don't think he's given up completely either. So, what are you going to do to show him that you're still the person he loved? Because, honestly, words aren't going to be enough. Mia knew Emily was right. It was time to act, but she didn't know where to start. When she got home, she found the place empty, Ethan's car not in the garage. She sat down on the sofa and looked around, the silence of the house seemed to amplify her loneliness. She picked up her phone and typed a message: I know I need to prove to you that I'm worthy of your forgiveness. I don't expect it to happen overnight, but I want to try. Tell me how we can start. Ethan read the message several times before replying. He was parked in front of a park, trying to decide whether or not to continue to the second session with the therapist. After a few minutes, he finally typed, I don't know how to start. But we can talk. When he returned home that evening, he found Mia waiting in the living room. There was something different about her, a look of determination that he hadn't seen for a long time. They sat down face to face, and for the first time in weeks, the conversation seemed sincere. Mia talked about her regrets, but this time she didn't try to justify her actions. "I was weak," she said. "And in the process, I ended up putting you and our lives in danger. But I want to change that." Ethan listened, but still didn't know if he could fully believe her. "I need time to see if I can trust you again, Mia. This isn't going to be easy for either of us." "I know," she replied in a calm tone, "but I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." Over the next few days, they slowly began to rebuild a routine, but now everything seemed different. Conversations were shorter, more formal. Ethan still maintained an emotional wall, while Mia tried to find small ways to show that she was committed to regaining his trust. However, there was something Mia hadn't told him yet, something she knew could change everything. Meanwhile, Ethan began to investigate Mia's boss's actions more deeply. He wanted to ensure that there would be no more threats to his company or his personal life. He hired a private investigator, someone who could go beyond the obvious. The information he received was revealing: the man had not only manipulated Mia, but was also involved in other illegal schemes within the company. Ethan knew he needed to take this to the authorities, but he also knew that involving Mia could complicate things even further. He decided to confront her again, this time with the new facts. When he got home that evening, he found Mia in her studio, finally painting. The scene touched him in an unexpected way. It was a glimpse of the woman he loved, trying to reconnect with herself. "We need to talk," he said, interrupting the moment. Mia turned around, surprised. "I've found out things about him, about what he did on top of all that. And I need to know, is there anything else you haven't told me?" Mia hesitated, and in that moment, Ethan knew there was more. "I was afraid of how you would react," she began. "But yes, there is something you need to know." Ethan's heart raced. He didn't know if he was ready to hear what came next, but he knew that this was the next step in the long journey they were on. Mia took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, while Ethan watched her, his patience slowly wearing thin. At that moment, everything seemed suspended, as if the world around them had stopped. The words she was about to say would change everything once again, but this time, Ethan knew he had to listen until the end. Mia took a deep breath, knowing that the words that were about to come out would change everything. Ethan, standing in front of her, looked like a statue, impenetrable and waiting. She lowered the brush she was holding, the vibrant red still running down the unfinished canvas, as if reflecting the chaos unfolding between them. "He asked me for information from you, Ethan," she began, hesitantly. "Not just about the contracts, but about you, your routine, your habits. I've never passed anything on directly, ever. But, he implied that he knew things that I didn't understand how he could know." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You mean he was using you as a source, even without you realizing it? Like he was manipulating you into confirming things?" "Yes," said Mia, her voice breaking. "I didn't realize it at the time. I thought they were just random questions, casual conversations. But looking back, I see how naive I was, how used." She started to cry, but Ethan remained silent, processing. The impact of her words seemed to unfold in his mind like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. "I hired an investigator," he said calmly. "He confirmed that that man was involved in a network of manipulations within the company. Blackmail, embezzlement, all that. But what bothers me is that he used you, Mia. Not just emotionally, but as a tool to access my life. He destroyed our trust, but you let him do it." Mia looked up at Ethan, her face streaked with tears. "You're right. I was wrong not to tell you from the start. But you don't understand how trapped I felt. Every step I took to try to get out, he pulled me in deeper. I didn't know how to fight it. And by the time I realized it, it was too late." Ethan took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping in a gesture of exhaustion. He knew he was at the limit of his strength. "I reported him," he finally said. The company has already started an internal investigation, and the authorities will take care of the rest. It's no longer about me or you. It's about what he did, to all of us. Mia nodded, knowing that this was inevitable. What about us? She finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolution. I don't know, Mia. You've not only broken my trust, you've jeopardized everything we've built together. I need time to decide if this is something we can rebuild, or if it's something we need to leave behind. The days that followed were silent and tense. Mia tried to give Ethan space, but the distance between them felt like an abyss. Ethan, for his part, was torn between the desire to move on and the pain of giving up what had once been a shared life. He plunged into work, closely following the investigation into Mia's boss, now officially fired and facing criminal charges. Without the man manipulating behind the scenes, things began to clear up. Other victims emerged, co-workers who had also been blackmailed or harmed. Ethan felt a strange sense of justice, but not revenge. He realized that although that man was responsible for many things, Mia's decisions were still hers, and that was what disturbed him most. One evening, while he was in the living room going over documents, Mia came in, holding a small suitcase. I'm going out for a while, she said, breaking the silence. Ethan looked at her, surprised. I need space as much as you do. And I want you to have the time you need to decide what you really want. I don't want to be here just to remind you of what happened. Ethan didn't answer right away. He just watched as she walked to the door. I still don't know what's going to happen, Mia, he finally said. But I hope you find what you're looking for. She looked at him one last time before leaving, silent tears streaming down her face. As the door closed, Ethan felt a wave of contradictory emotions, relief, sadness, and perhaps even a touch of hope. With Mia gone, Ethan began to rebuild his routine, but he also allowed himself to reflect on what really mattered to him. For weeks, he revisited memories, good and bad, trying to separate what was real from what had been destroyed. The therapist he kept visiting helped him realize that his final decision didn't have to be about punishment, but about what would make him happy. Mia, meanwhile, spent her time away in her family's small cottage, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. There, she began to paint again, each painting an expression of the inner turmoil she was still facing. She knew she might never be able to make things right with Ethan, but she was determined to rebuild herself, regardless of the outcome. Months later, Ethan and Mia met again. He called her to a cafe, a neutral place where they could talk without the pressure of the house they had once shared. When she arrived, she seemed different. Calmer, more centered. He noticed this immediately. I wanted to see you to thank you, he began. For coming out, for giving you space. I think we both needed it more than we realized. Mia smiled, although there was sadness in her eyes. I needed to find myself again, Ethan. And I hope you found what you needed too. Ethan took a deep breath. I think I have. And what I've found is that, although I love you, I don't know if I can trust you again. And without trust, there's no way we can move forward together. Mia nodded slowly, tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. I understand, she said simply. They both left that meeting with a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the ending either of them had imagined, but it was the only one possible. And with that, they each began a new chapter, apart, but somehow stronger. If you've made it this far, let us know what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more impactful stories like this one. And remember, under no circumstances does this channel support any kind of betrayal. See you next time.